Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, and best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to learn how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Hello, everyone. This is your host, Michael Marchuk. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. On this episode, we'll be talking with an author and speaker and entrepreneur, Dan Keldsen, about digital transformation and the Gen Z effect. Welcome, Dan.
Hey, Michael. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So, Dan, you're a man who wears many hats. Can you introduce yourself and let us know all the things that you've got going on? Because I think they're very interesting and blend into this topic that we're talking about today.
Yeah, I have enough hats that I can't wear hats anymore. Yeah, so it's funny. You never know where your career is going to go, or at least I certainly didn't. My most recent ventures are a Plexicam, which is how we initially got introduced to a mutual friend. And a Plexicam is essentially the modern alternative to a tripod or a teleprompter setup. The other business is Viventus, which stands for virtual events. It's about as hard to spell as my own last name, so I have that going for me. And that was built to take advantage of this shift that we've all been thrust into.
Gotcha. In addition to all of that, you found some time to write a book called The Gen Z Effect. Can you briefly explain what the Gen Z effect is, and how is the Gen Z effect different to Gen X and millennials if they have their own?
Yeah. So the Gen Z effect, we could have called the book Aren't Gen Z Wonderful? And sure, they are. And so is Gen X, and so are boomers. And every generation has its thing. So some people will remember the Palmolive commercial from a long time ago. You're soaking in it is the line from that. So this effect, the Gen Z effect, is we're all taking advantage of the things that Gen Z takes for granted, because the technology that they took for granted when they were born is the technology that we're all using now. We're all using, the vast majority of the world is using the internet. There's a ton, billions and billions of smartphones that have been sold, iPads and tablets and the cloud. And what if the pandemic had happened 10 years ago and we didn't have Zoom? This last year and a half would have been a lot harder, I think, than not to mention the biotech stuff that made vaccines possible in such a short time. So the Gen Z effect is really about accelerating change, really embracing technology from my perspective, to put more humanity back into living and working and all of that kind of stuff, and just being able to take advantage of what's possible these days. I think to your point about the Gen X effect or the millennial effect, I think part of what we're trying to say is you can learn from any generation. And the entire idea, which unfortunately came to light back in the 60s, and Margaret Mead wrote about, generational chasms don't do anybody any good. And it's always the older generation is not good. The younger generation is also not good unless they're your kids. And even then, it's questionable, right? So it's if we can equalize the playing field, that anybody can learn from anybody else. There's a reason why grandkids help their grandparents figure out how to use a smartphone. It's because they already have that bond and they trust each other anyhow, and they want to help. And if you extend that into the workplace, I've been a big proponent of enterprise collaboration for a long time. And there's so much more we could do together if we just leverage each other's strengths instead of trying to push somebody else down and label them with whatever it is that you want to label them.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. And it kind of transitions this concept of digital transformation, and more specifically engaging automation to enhance a business outcome. Sure. It's not inherently generational specifically, but what factors from the Gen Z effect or the thought process are changing the way that companies are approaching digital transformation?
Yeah, so I think what I like about mixed blessings, but digital transformation can be either a very big umbrella or it can be a very specific slice. So like the college experience today, very different from a process standpoint. Kids do not fill out the classes they're going to take on a piece of paper that gets rekeyed by somebody else and rekeyed and rekeyed and rekeyed into some mainframe. It might still be a mainframe on the back end. They're not all bad, as it turns out. But there's a better way to do it because we have smarter technology, and when we understand that things like customer experience matter, employee experience matter, you can say student experience or alumni experience, right? There's all sorts of things that if you care about taking something from a God, I hate calling customer service to, oh my God, we have customer success, like in the enterprise world. They're there. That is their job, is to proactively reach out to make sure that I do have success and not be the ones that are bracing at the other end of the phone saying, oh God, here comes another complaint, which is also, it's not like that goes away, but your odds of success overall go up. So I think that the digital transformation piece that Gen Z is taking for granted, and I'm taking for granted, we're probably all taking for granted. Look at what happened with restaurants in the last year and a half. In a lot of ways, and we can talk about slingshotting in a minute, I can't tell you how many, I live in the greater Boston area, tens of thousands at least restaurants in this area. How many of those were actually online in any way, let alone being able to order, being able to do curbside pickup, which wasn't even a thing that anybody thought of except for some very small situations. They still didn't get social media, even though social media had been around for 20 years by the time we hit last year. All of that it's just combined to force everybody to rethink, hey, we could really change. There's great benefits to our customers. There's great benefits to us. It's easier to onboard employees, all those kinds of things. When you actually pay attention to the process, then you can actually unlock a whole lot of things that you couldn't even have dreamt of until you wipe that off the table and then had a fresh slate to really open your mind. We actually have the opportunity because now those are solid and we can focus all that firefighting into delighting our customers instead of bracing for the worst.
So on that note, some of those kind of discussions we've had with our customers and we've had with other advisory firms, this sort of zero-based design thinking where we're taking a clean sheet of paper and reformulating what that end outcome could look like as we step through the process backwards, understand where we need to have people and where digital resources could be put in place, where systems could be put in place, where we just get rid of all components altogether. How do you see that being affected by this concept of a generational thought process, a Gen Z effect on that?
One of the things I talk about in the book is called the ideal final result. And that comes from an innovation toolkit that came from Russia about the same time as Lean was coming out of Japan and America in World War II. And basically, it's some people say it's blue sky thinking. What would happen if you took away all the pain and just got the result? And is there a way to get there? And often on enterprise side, I've been a part of $100 million implementations of things that took 10 years and nobody ever wants to touch them again because that was such a painful process. But to literally put together, about 10 years ago, I started doing real videos of that entire process. And I would say, here it goes. Here comes an inbound sales lead that takes 2 months for some reason to turn around into an actual proposal. And then round and around, it goes backwards, it goes forward. Here's the entire video. And it looks like total chaos because it is, right? And then you can say, so all this wait time, if you took it out, and one example I'm thinking of, they had 3 different ticketing systems for some reason. Each department that had to touch this had their own, totally independent, not fit from anything, ticketing system. They would have to recreate a new ticket with new information, not all of it, because not every system had the same capabilities. And then humans would have to go figure out what got dropped every time because there's not quite the same information. So that whole process, nobody should have a tolerance for that anymore. You can tell Alexa, thankfully I don't have one in this room right now, but I could, tell Alexa to order my favorite pizza from Domino's and I'm done. It'll be here in 20 minutes, right? If you think that's what you're aiming for, instead of our process is we send paper out, you fill it out, you fax it back in, which I can't believe still isn't dead yet. And then somebody probably has to rekey it unless you're doing OCR and all those kinds of things. And it's just, what if you reimagine it and say, our customers want to buy food from us and get it as quickly as possible, still hot, to their doorstep? If we reimagine that, what would it take? And I don't know for certain for Domino's, for example, but I'm willing to bet that they took a blank slate approach to that. And okay, that's our goal. We'll use Alexa because at the time when they came out with that was the go-to voice device. Let's make that work. And then you experiment out from there. So it's really part of this. I could go into a whole rant about waterfall versus agile and all those fun kind of things.
So I want to ask about specifically, you said customers. So let's go from this generational perspective again. Look at customers who may not be tech savvy. So we may still have a good number of customers who are, say, perhaps in the healthcare area that are not as tech savvy as perhaps some of the new millennials and Gen Zs are because of their age. Again, and we all know it's a very big generalization and probably an overly broad generalization. But the idea is that not all customers for these institutions will be as comfortable using the technology as perhaps some of the children who've grown up on it and know nothing else. So when you're looking at that, how do you apply the same kind of design thinking to apply to those customers without abandoning them or disenchanting them?
Yeah, I think actually part of the reason I stumbled into caring very specifically in studying user experience design back in the early 2000s, which only happened because my old roommate from Berkeley was doing music software for a company called Motu in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And musicians know a lot of things, but they shouldn't have to type arcane commands. They have other things to do that are not learn the intricacies of computer programs that, frankly, until recently, have not been very well designed. They are functional, but they're not built to be easy to use. And I've run into that an unbelievable number of times. At one point, Perot Systems had acquired Delphi Group. This was 2004 is when we got acquired. Ironically, we reported to Jim Champy, who you might remember from Champy and Michael Hammer, the whole business process reengineering movement, which literally Michael Hammer would say, sometimes you just have to smash your process to bits and start again. And it turns out he's often right about that. But if you really reframe it, the concept of, as you said, that different generations, clearly old people, whatever old means to you, doesn't mean that they're bad at technology. But we are, I don't like the term because it doesn't work for me, but our minds are like plastic. So they say that as you do things, essentially a groove gets written in there, and it can be hard to disturb that and relearn something new, which is also not true. That's not the modern thinking on behavior change. Highly recommend BJ Fogg's Tiny Habits for anybody that's interested in that. Awesome stuff. You can change habits, but the pain of changing the habit to whatever the new benefit is that leap to the new future needs to be better. And most like healthcare systems are some of between healthcare and ERP systems, it's like a pox on the planet. Those are the worst ever right? At this point, because they're so complex, and there's a reason for it. They're so complex, and there's different regulations for different states and countries, and dental versus health, normal health, and all that. It's very complex. So I understand, but they're built to be functional because that world is hideously complex, and they're just happy that a process happens and they can track it however it took to make it happen. From the user perspective, what I like about solutions like what you guys are doing, if you can put a layer on top of it, I think of meta layers. So if you can put a layer on top that has essentially fingers into it, or whatever, integration points into underlying systems, maybe the user is secretly using 6 different systems behind the scene, but from them, they're seeing a single pane of glass, is often the way that's talked about. And they don't have to worry about all the crazy things that the people that used to have to deal with green screens, for example. You better know all the secret commands on every single screen you're ever going to see, because otherwise that sucker's not going to work. And I think what I like, and part of the Gen Z effect, is Gen Z expects, why in the world would I have to type something ever, maybe, let alone on a command line? And why should anybody have to do that? Part of what I talk about with slingshotting is there's a reason why, I think the iPad is one of the best examples of this. There are hundreds of millions of people who are older than I am or my age who never owned a computer. Their first computer was voice activated. You could use all of your fingers. You could hold it in the palm of your hand. It could last for 5-8 hours, whatever. And you didn't need to know about a mouse. Which direction do you hold the mouse in? Do you press the right or the left button? None of that stuff. So they could just point, click. And actually, the main reason I've been told that the iPad sold so initially was due to Angry Birds. That's not like it was a great reason, but it was so much fun. And it was such a different metaphor that it got people to think, oh, I don't have to use a keyboard, and I don't have to use a mouse, and I don't have to use all this other stuff. I can just use my finger and fling birds at pigs. And there you go. And that's a bonding moment for grandkids and grandparents. And then it spills out from there. And I don't have to worry about any of the stuff that comes with a traditional computer.
The book describes the concept of slingshotting. And I was hoping you could describe what that means and how it could affect the way that organizations are looking at their future business models?
Okay. So slingshotting came out of a lot of people in the tech space know about Crossing the Chasm, Jeffrey Moore's book. It's a bell curve where it talks about market adoption, right? So there's the crazy people in the front, the early adopters and innovators. There's the chasm where a good idea has either actually found a problem that it solves for the world or it falls into the chasm and dies. There's I forget what the terminology is, Main Street, I think it is, or mainstream, late adopters and laggards. So that makes up who is going to participate in the market. Slingshotting says there's a lot of those curves, actually. There's not just one universal curve that takes care of everything. It's not predetermined for the entire world. So things like connectivity has its own curve. Are you connected at all? That's the base. You can't do all this other fun stuff that we're talking about until you're online. What are computers like? Are they friendly or not? And so the people that are like me, perhaps like you, probably, we're willing to suffer through some pain up front to see what the next new thing has for potential, and we can see that potential. Other people who might be smarter than us think, what? That looks janky and it's expensive and I don't have time for that. So I'm going to wait until all that's been worked out and I can just go buy it from a kiosk when I'm at the mall or whatever it is. I can rent it. It can be delivered to me, whatever. But I don't have time for the rest of the stuff. And I think, like to our last example, doctors, anybody in healthcare, they've spent, I don't know how to do brain surgery. I don't know how to do any surgery. There's a whole bunch of specialty stuff that they know that is way more important than for them to know how to use whatever system they're given. So I think slingshotting is a way for me to tell people, if you think much bigger, you can suddenly see opportunities that had been sitting there if you were looking and were willing to experiment early, that all of a sudden seem to come out of nowhere, like the iPad. Within the first year, they sold hundreds of millions of iPads. There'd been 20 years of tablets that were generated before then. They were terrible. There's a reason why they weren't as popular. So if you use that same sort of mindset to rethinking, how do I execute anything in my business? Maybe it's time for me to switch my business model. Like in telehealth has been a great idea for a long time. And suddenly it is the idea because that's how we had to do healthcare in the last year and a half. And that sometimes you can make yourself see things. Sometimes the world shoves it in your face and says, telehealth is now the way you're going to do your healthcare. I don't care because or it's not going to end well. So that's now the question is, does that stick or not? Here in Massachusetts, the copays are going back into place. Is there still an advantage to doing telehealth, or do you want to go into the office? And unless you're bleeding or broken or something, probably you don't want to go back in the office.
So when you look at businesses that look at these transformations they're trying to accomplish, how can business embrace the Gen Z effect that would give them an enhanced experience for their customers, but also for their employees?
Yeah. So some of the tips that a lot of people that talk about Gen Z tend to throw out is that you should go live where Gen Z lives, meaning where do they shop? How do they interact with their friends? What social media are they on? And that's useful to get you acclimated to it. On the other hand, what I learned in doing consulting work over the years, you don't have to observe them. They're, sharks in a tank and you can't get in there with them. You could go talk to them. They're your kids and your neighbors and your new hire and your customers and maybe your next CEO, who knows? If you just go talk to people, regardless of what generation they are, there's a lot that you can learn. And you can just ask them. Overall, Gen Z does not want to be on the phone as the traditional way that we used to think of phones. It's not for voice. It's for basically everything except for voice, unless you happen to be recording voice or singing in the context of Snapchat or TikTok or Instagram or whatever. So it's go talk to your customers. There's just so much useful in listening to, call it voice of the customer. Just go talk to people that are either your existing customers, whatever that means, or the potential customers that you could see. And it's just observe and ask. And what do you have to lose? Except maybe you'll find some things out sooner in a far less expensive way than launching a product that just dies, like the Amazon phone, if you remember that thing. It just exploded into a bust.
What about the employee experience?
Yeah. So it has always bothered me that the employee experience was often not addressed at all. So it's a sort of expectation in a lot of companies, especially software companies or any new company that's being created, that there is an onboarding experience. which I've been employed for 35 years or so. Until recently, I had never heard that before and had experienced it myself. Like our onboarding when Perot acquired us was a 10-minute chat with the HR guy. Here's your new salary, and here's your new email address and credentials. Get logged in. Ta-da! So, and that's at the time that was a 15,000 person organization. That's, in fairness, that was 2004. But it's the same kind of thing that if you are going to learn from other industries, if you're going to learn from things that younger generations do expect, great employee onboarding experiences, to me, look at what a gaming onboarding experience is. So if you play any sort of online games or not online games, there is a process. The money they make, they sell you the app typically up front. But if they're going to get their monthly fee from you for the subscription that you're also buying, they need to make sure that you know how to play the game and enjoy it. Because if you can't figure that out, then you are not going to pay them monthly or whatever the time frame is. Same thing with, in the enterprise world, that's the whole movement to software as a service and all of that. If you are not aware of what makes people happy or unhappy as an employee or as a customer or a gamer, whatever it is, then you're going to do things that you probably didn't intend to do that greatly irritates people. And all it takes is go talk to employees. What was their experience coming from a previous job? What was their onboarding experience like? And you could easily argue that it starts before you become an employee, because the onboarding experience as a potential candidate, how many times have you heard or experienced yourself, you showed up for an interview and nobody was there, especially on camera, right? They couldn't be bothered, or you send in a resume, nobody, not even a robot, nothing gets back to you. And that does not send a good signal. If a company trying to sell you something, which they are, took that same approach, you would find a competitor and put your money elsewhere. So if you're investing in yourself as an employee, and if you feel like you as the company are investing in employees, then you need to pay attention and really map that kind of, what does that process look like? What is it that attracts the people that are going to be right for our culture, and do it in a way where it's very transparent. Transparency is a marvelous thing, and it exposes a whole lot of opportunities, and yes, probably a bunch of stuff that you hadn't looked at before.
So do you think that there's a generational bias towards looking at technology differently? So when we look at automation, for example, or bringing in things that we're automating components of a job or automating large pieces of process, do you think that there's a different generational bias or review of that same activity?
Yeah, I think that's funny. I would tend to say that the older generations are more fearful that automation is going to harm their opportunities. And there's plenty of examples where this is not true, but younger generations tend to think if that process is no good, then of course we should automate it, because why should somebody have to do that? But I think so the heart of the Gen Z effect is that, look, your age really makes no difference. Old dogs can learn new tricks. It's a wonderful phrase and all, but that they can learn new tricks. And old is all relative anyhow. There's most people who are younger than I am, and I'm 51, unless they went into computer science, they're never going to know as much as I know about how computers work. And it's not because I was trained on it, it's because I had to, otherwise computers would not work that I was using. So it's, I think part of it is, are you confident in what you are delivering as value as an employee? And part of that is, are you recognized as valuable within your company? And if you aren't, then you're going to see anything that smells like, hey, they're trying to eliminate my job, as maybe they are trying to eliminate your job. Jobs don't last forever. Maybe there's another job that you can go to. The entire concept, to me, I've always had a good or bad habit of saying yes to trying something different until I wear like a dozen hats. And when I was at Delphi, I became the CTO. Eventually, I was an industry analyst covering security and workflow and knowledge management and all sorts of stuff. I was doing consulting. I was teaching workshops. I was doing keynotes. I was doing podcasts. I was doing all sorts of things. And for some reason, I didn't let go of the other stuff that I was still doing. I don't recommend that. But if you're always looking at what's the next thing for me, maybe it's not even at your company. Maybe you should go to a different company where you can get a different experience, or go to a deeper level. Maybe you should find another place to work that does, or you could try to be the champion while you're there, or do both. So it's, I think it's a trap that's self-imposed, but there is a lot between what's your perception as a person, employee, what's the perception of the culture and how it treats people. You're out. And the classic, now you get to train your replacement.
Right. Yeah, generally that doesn't happen that way, but I know that I see where your point is on the generations, not necessarily be a generational thing, but more of a continuous learning thing. And that's really where it comes down to understanding where you're at within your role and how that affects your job. The discussion's been awesome. And I really appreciate you joining us today on the Transform Now podcast. Thanks again for everything you do. And I will put a link in the podcast to your book so others can take a look at and read it.
Awesome. Yeah, no, great to be on. And by the way, since you just touched on it, one of the 6 forces of the Gen Z effect is about always learning.
Well, that's a really good point, Dan. Thanks again for joining us today. I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more, check out our podcast channel where you'll find all of our previous episodes. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you like what you heard, please leave us a review. For more information about digital transformation and the future of work, check out blueprism.com to learn how Blue Prism's digital workforce is enabling enterprise transformation now.